My son ran a meth lab in my basement for 2 years, and I had absolutely no idea. My name is Patricia Kendrick. I'm 76 years old, and I spent 38 years as a supervising nurse at Cleveland Memorial Hospital. I've seen gunshot wounds, overdoses, and every kind of human tragedy you can imagine. I thought nothing could shock me anymore. I was wrong. For 46 years, I've lived in the same Victorian house in a quiet Cleveland neighborhood, the kind of street where people wave to each other and know everyone's name. My husband Thomas and I raised 2 boys here. We paid off the mortgage in 2008, 3 years before he passed from a heart attack. After he died, my oldest son Brian became my helper. He had keys, he handled repairs. He told me not to worry my fragile old legs about going down to the basement. I thought he was being a good son. Last Thursday morning, a plumber named Frank ran up from my basement with his hands shaking and his face white as a sheet. What he told me next would expose a betrayal so deep it would cost my son 12 years in prison, cost me $45,000 in toxic chemical cleanup, and teach me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who think you're too old and confused to fight back. They were wrong about that. If you want to hear how a 76-year-old nurse took down her own son's drug operation and reclaimed her dignity, stay with me. This story gets darker before it gets better, but I promise you, it's worth hearing until the end. And if this resonates with you, subscribe so you don't miss stories like mine, because every grandmother has a story that needs to be told. The smell started on a Monday. I remember because Mondays are when I do my laundry, and I always open the basement door to check if anything down there needs washing. The moment I cracked that door open, this chemical odor hit me. Sharp, acrid, nothing like the musty smell old basements sometimes get. After 40 years working in hospitals, I know smells. I know the difference between mold and medicine, between decay and disinfectant. This was something else entirely. Something industrial. I called Brian that same afternoon. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear that edge in his voice, the one he gets when he's busy and doesn't want to be interrupted. I told him about the smell, described it as best I could. There was this pause, just a beat too long, before he said it was probably just old pipes or maybe a dead mouse in the walls. He promised he'd come by on the weekend to check it out, but the weekend came and went. Brian showed up for Sunday dinner like always, brought his wife Jennifer and my 2 grandsons. Over pot roast, I mentioned the smell again. This time, I watched his face carefully. Something I'd learned to do during my nursing years when patients weren't telling me the whole truth about their symptoms. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted to Jennifer, then back to his plate. He told me he'd schedule someone to come look at it, that I shouldn't worry, that with my age, I probably shouldn't be going up and down those basement stairs anyway. That last part stung more than he knew. My age. Like 76 meant incompetent. By Tuesday, the smell had gotten worse. It was seeping up through the floorboards, creeping into my kitchen. I opened windows even though it was cold outside. I burned scented candles. Nothing helped. That night, I barely slept. The smell seemed to intensify in the darkness, and with it came this nagging feeling in my gut, the same instinct that used to tell me when something was wrong with a patient, even before the monitors started beeping. Wednesday morning, I decided to call a plumber myself. I wasn't going to wait for Brian to schedule someone. I looked up Morrison & Sons in the phone book. Yes, I still use a phone book, and I'm not ashamed of it. The woman who answered said they could send someone out Thursday morning. I booked the appointment and didn't tell Brian. Something told me not to. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray. Frank Delgado showed up at 9:15 in a white van with the company logo. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s, professional and polite. He asked me to describe the problem, and I walked him to the basement door. The moment I opened it, he actually stepped back. He smelled it too. He told me he'd go down and investigate, asked me to wait upstairs. I went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, trying to calm the anxiety that was building in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a busted pipe, maybe some chemical cleanser Thomas had stored down there years ago that had leaked. Nothing sinister. Just an old house being an old house. Then I heard Frank's boots on the basement stairs. Running. heavy, urgent footsteps pounding up toward the kitchen. My nurse's instincts kicked in immediately. That kind of running meant emergency, meant danger, meant something very wrong. Frank burst into my kitchen, and I'll never forget the look on his face. He wasn't just concerned, he was frightened. His hands were trembling as he pulled out his cell phone. He looked at me with something like pity mixed with alarm and said the words that would change everything. He told me not to go down there. He told me we needed to leave the house immediately and call the police. And when I demanded to know why, when I used that firm voice I'd perfected over decades of managing emergency rooms and demanding straight answers from doctors who tried to sugarcoat things, he finally told me the truth. There was a laboratory in my basement, a full setup with chemical equipment, heating elements, containers, tubes, and substances he recognized from growing up in a rough neighborhood. He'd seen this before. He knew exactly what it was. Someone had been cooking methamphetamine in my house. My legs went weak. I gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself. 76 years old, and I felt like I was learning to stand for the first time. A meth lab. In my house. In the home where I'd raised my children, where I'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where my husband had died peacefully in our bedroom upstairs 7 years ago. That sacred space had been violated in the most horrific way imaginable. Frank was already dialing 911 when I heard it. The sound that made my blood run cold. The front door burst open. Brian stood in my doorway, sweating despite the cold morning, his chest heaving like he'd been running. In that split second, I understood everything. He wasn't supposed to be here. He lived 20 minutes away, had no reason to show up at my house on a Thursday morning. But somehow he knew. Somehow he'd known the exact moment to arrive. He'd been watching me. Frank stepped between us immediately, his phone still in his hand with 911 on the line. He told Brian to stay where he was, that the police were already on their way. I watched my son's face cycle through expressions: panic, anger, desperation, and finally something that looked almost like calculation. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out if he could still talk his way out of this. He looked at me with those eyes I'd gazed into when he was a newborn, when he was 5 and scraped his knee, when he graduated high school. He asked me what was happening, why we were calling the police, his voice climbing higher with each word. But I'd spent 4 decades reading people in crisis, and I could see through him now like he was made of glass. I asked him directly if he knew about the drug laboratory in my basement, about the meth lab in my house. The silence that followed told me everything. It stretched for maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like 5 years. Then the excuses started pouring out, rambling, frantic justifications about gambling debts, about how it was only temporary, about how I never went down to the basement anyway, so he wasn't really hurting me. He actually said that because I wasn't aware of it, it somehow wasn't a betrayal. Then he said something that made my hands clench into fists. He told me I didn't understand how the world worked today, that bills didn't pay themselves, that Dad had left me comfortable, but he had a family and expenses. As if Thomas's life insurance and our retirement savings that we'd scrimped and saved for were somehow unfair to him. As if my financial security was a personal insult. The police arrived within minutes. I watched through my front window as 3 cruisers pulled up, followed by an unmarked sedan and a hazmat vehicle. My quiet street where I'd lived for 46 years suddenly looked like a crime scene from the evening news. Neighbors came out onto their porches. Mrs. Chen from next door, who I'd had coffee with just last week. The Rodriguez family across the street, whose children I'd watched grow up. All of them watching as officers in protective gear entered my home. Brian tried to hug me, actually tried to put his arms around me while crying and apologizing. I stepped back so fast I nearly stumbled. I told him not to touch me, that he'd turned the house where I'd raised him, where his father died with dignity, into a drug den. The officer nearest to us gently guided Brian outside, while another detective introduced herself to me. Her name was Detective Sarah Booth, and she had kind eyes that had seen too much. She asked if I was aware of any illegal activity on my property. I told her everything, about the smell, about Brian's evasiveness, about how he'd always discouraged me from going to the basement, always had excuses ready. She took notes and nodded, and I could see she believed me. But she also explained something that made my stomach drop. There were civil forfeiture laws. If my property was used for drug manufacturing, the state could potentially seize it, even if I wasn't involved. The house I'd lived in for 46 years, that Thomas and I had paid off over 30 years of mortgage payments, could be taken from me because of what my son had done. That's when the shock started wearing off and the rage set in. Over the next 3 days, while hazmat teams worked in my basement and I stayed at a hotel the police arranged, I started making calls. First to my younger son Daniel, who was absolutely horrified. Then to the hospital volunteer coordinator, who connected me with Lawrence Chen, an attorney who specialized in elder law and criminal defense. Lawrence was second-generation Chinese-American, sharp as a scalpel, and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when his clients were victims. I met with Lawrence in his office on Saturday morning. I brought everything. Years of emails where I'd asked Brian to fix things in the basement and he'd made excuses, medical records showing my knees were actually fine, despite Brian's constant comments about my fragile legs, phone records, bank statements. Lawrence listened to everything, taking meticulous notes. Then he asked me a question that stopped me cold. He asked when Brian had gotten keys to my house. I had to think back. It was shortly after Thomas died, maybe 8 months later. Brian had insisted, said it was for emergencies, that I was alone now, and what if something happened and no one could get in to help me? At the time, it seemed thoughtful. Now I realized it was calculated. He'd been planning this for years, waiting for the right opportunity to exploit his elderly mother's trust. Lawrence had me request my home security system records. I'd installed cameras at the front and back doors 2 years ago, after a rash of package thefts in the neighborhood. When we reviewed the footage, a pattern emerged that made my blood boil. Brian had been entering my house on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always mid-morning, always on the days I volunteered at the hospital. Like clockwork. The timestamps were damning. But the worst discovery came on Monday of the following week. Lawrence had a private investigator pull Brian's financial records, legally, as part of building my defense. What we found made me physically ill. Brian owed $180,000 to various creditors, including some very dangerous people based on the investigator's analysis. The meth lab wasn't just stupid greed. It was desperation, and I was collateral damage. He'd been running this operation for almost 2 years. 2 years of walking into my home, going down to my basement, manufacturing poison, all while telling me stories about his kids' soccer games and accepting my Sunday pot roasts. 2 years of looking me in the eye and lying. Lawrence showed me something else the investigator had uncovered. Brian had installed cameras inside my house too, hidden ones, to monitor my movements and make sure I wouldn't accidentally discover his operation. My own son had been surveilling me like I was the criminal. I sat in Lawrence's office, staring at printouts of my son's debts and photographs of tiny cameras that had been hidden in my living room and kitchen, and I made a decision. Some people might think a mother should always protect her child, should always choose blood over justice. Those people haven't had their entire life violated by someone who was supposed to love them. I looked Lawrence in the eye and told him I wanted Brian prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The hardest part wasn't deciding to cooperate with the prosecution. The hardest part was having to see Brian again and pretend I hadn't already made my choice. Lawrence explained the strategy carefully. The prosecutors needed my full cooperation, but they also needed to document Brian's pattern of manipulation and elder abuse. That meant I had to interact with him, let him try to convince me not to testify, let him reveal his true colors on record. Lawrence arranged for me to wear a wire during a visit Brian requested through his attorney. I'm not going to lie. Walking into that county jail visiting room took every ounce of strength I had. I'd never been inside a jail before. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the chairs bolted to the floor, everything designed to strip away dignity. When they brought Brian in, wearing that orange jumpsuit, I almost broke. Almost. Because he still looked like my boy, like the child I'd rocked to sleep and driven to baseball practice. Then he opened his mouth. He sat down across from me, separated by a scratched plexiglass divider, and picked up the phone. I picked up mine. He immediately started crying, telling me how sorry he was, how he never meant for any of this to happen, how he'd made terrible mistakes. I let him talk, keeping my face as neutral as I'd learned to do during difficult patient conversations. My expression gave him nothing. Then he said what Lawrence predicted he would say. He told me that if I testified against him, I'd be destroying our family. He reminded me that his boys, my grandsons, needed their father. He said Jennifer was already talking about divorce, that I was the only one who could save him. He actually used the word save, like he was the victim in this scenario. I asked him directly about the cameras he'd installed in my house, the hidden ones, the ones monitoring my every move so he could run his drug operation without getting caught. He had the audacity to tell me those were for my safety, that he wanted to make sure I was okay, living alone at my age, that he worried about me falling or having a medical emergency. He said it with such conviction, such sincerity, that if I hadn't known better, I might have almost believed him. But I'd had 76 years to learn when someone was lying to me, and my own son was doing it badly. I asked about the $180,000 in debts. His face changed then. The tears stopped, and something harder emerged. He told me I didn't understand pressure, that I'd never had to support a family in today's economy, that my generation had it easy with cheap houses and guaranteed pensions. He was actually resentful of me, angry that I had financial security in my old age while he was drowning. Then he made his biggest mistake. He leaned closer to the glass and told me that if I really loved him, I'd tell the prosecutors I knew about the lab, that I'd take partial responsibility, claim we were in it together. The sentence would be lighter for both of us that way, he said. We could split the blame. He wanted me to go to prison to save him. I sat there staring at this man I'd given life to, and I saw someone I didn't recognize, someone who would sacrifice his elderly mother's freedom, her reputation, her remaining years on earth, just to reduce his own consequences. The wire recording every word felt like validation against my skin. I told him very calmly that I would not be doing that I would be testifying truthfully about everything, about how he manipulated me, isolated me from my own basement, used my age as a weapon against me. I watched his expression shift from pleading to panic to cold calculation. He told me I was making a mistake, that people would think I was a foolish old woman who couldn't even control what happened in her own house, that my friends and neighbors would judge me, wonder how I could be so stupid not to notice. He was trying to shame me into silence, using my pride and my reputation as leverage. But here's what Brian never understood about getting older. When you reach 76, you stop caring quite so much what people think. You've buried friends, survived losses, watched the world change in ways you never imagined. You develop a clarity about what actually matters. And what mattered to me wasn't protecting my image. It was protecting my integrity. I stood up, placed the phone back on its cradle, and walked out of that visiting room without looking back. Behind me, I could hear Brian shouting my name through the glass, his voice muffled but desperate. The guard asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than I'd been in years. Because for the first time since that Thursday morning when Frank ran up from my basement, I felt like I had power again. Brian thought my age made me weak, made me easy to manipulate with guilt and family obligation. He'd forgotten that age also brings experience, wisdom, and the hard-earned knowledge that some people will only respect you when you show them you can't be pushed around. The wire recording became Exhibit A in the prosecution's case for elder abuse. Lawrence Chen called me 2 days after the jail visit with news that made my heart race. The prosecution had reviewed the wire recording and wanted to offer me full immunity in exchange for my complete cooperation. Full immunity meant no possibility of losing my house through civil forfeiture, no criminal charges, nothing. They believed me. More than that, they wanted to use my case to send a message about elder abuse. But immunity came with conditions. I had to provide everything, every document, every email, every piece of evidence I had. I had to testify in detail about Brian's manipulation tactics. And I had to be prepared for his defense attorney to try tearing me apart on the stand, painting me as either complicit or incompetent. Lawrence warned me it wouldn't be pleasant. I told him I'd survived 38 years in hospital emergency rooms. I could survive a cross-examination. The first thing Lawrence had me do was create a timeline. We sat in his office with a legal pad, and I walked him through every interaction with Brian over the past 5 years, starting from shortly after Thomas died. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Brian had systematically positioned himself as my caretaker, my protector, the good son who was looking after his elderly mother. Every offer to help was actually a way to control access to my home and monitor my activities. We documented how he'd discouraged me from hiring contractors for repairs, always insisting he'd handle it himself or find someone trustworthy. Now I understood why. He couldn't risk an outsider going into that basement. We found emails where I'd asked him 3 separate times over 18 months about strange smells or noises from downstairs, and each time he'd attributed it to old house problems or my imagination. One email actually said I was probably just more sensitive to smells as I got older, implying my senses were failing. Lawrence had his investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Webb, dig deeper into Brian's life. What Marcus uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. The gambling debts weren't just bad luck or poor judgment. Brian had been lying to Jennifer for years about their finances, secretly draining their savings and taking out loans against their house. Jennifer genuinely had no idea how bad things had gotten. She thought they were struggling, but managing. She didn't know her husband owed money to people who broke kneecaps when payments were late. Marcus also discovered that Brian had tried this before. Not a meth lab, but he'd attempted to rent out Thomas's workshop behind our house without telling me 3 years ago. A neighbor had mentioned seeing people coming and going, and when I asked Brian about it, he'd called the neighbor a busybody and told me she was confused. I'd believed him then. Now I realized he'd been testing how much he could get away with. The most damaging evidence came from Brian's own mistakes. Marcus retrieved deleted text messages from Brian's phone records through the discovery process. In those messages, Brian had talked to his gambling buddies about his setup, bragging about how his old lady never went downstairs and wouldn't know meth from mothballs. He'd actually joked about it, made fun of me to his criminal friends. Reading those texts felt like being punched. Each mocking reference to my age, each laugh about how easy I was to manipulate, each casual dismissal of my intelligence, they added up to a portrait of contempt. Brian didn't love me. I'm not sure he ever had. I was just convenient, a resource to be exploited. But we needed more than just evidence of Brian's crimes. Lawrence explained that to really protect me and make the elder abuse charges stick, we needed to demonstrate a clear pattern of him specifically targeting my vulnerabilities as an older person. We needed to show this wasn't just drug manufacturing. It was the exploitation of a senior citizen. That's when I remembered the doctor's appointments. About a year ago, Brian had started insisting on taking me to my medical checkups. At the time, I thought it was sweet, attentive. Now I wondered what he'd really been doing. I requested copies of all my medical records from the past 2 years. What we found was stunning. After appointments where Brian had accompanied me, there were notes in my chart about possible cognitive decline and patient seems confused about home maintenance issues. Brian had been talking to my doctors. He'd been painting a picture of a woman losing her mental sharpness, someone who couldn't be trusted to accurately report what was happening in her own home. He was building a defense before he even needed one. If I ever discovered the lab and reported it, he could claim I was confused, unreliable, that my age had caught up with me. But here's what Brian didn't count on. I had allies. Dr. Rebecca Singh, my primary care physician for 15 years, had actually noted in her records that she found Brian's characterizations inconsistent with patients' presentation and test results. She'd written that I was sharp, articulate, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. She documented her skepticism of Brian's concerns. Dr. Singh was going to be a powerful witness. Lawrence assembled a team of experts. A geriatric psychiatrist evaluated me and found 0 evidence of any mental decline. A toxicology expert was prepared to testify about the dangers of meth lab exposure and how lucky I was that the chemicals hadn't killed me. Frank Delgado, the plumber who'd discovered everything, gave a detailed deposition about my shock and Brian's panicked arrival. We built a case that was airtight, but I wanted more than just to win in court. I wanted consequences that would matter. I asked Lawrence about my will. He arranged for me to meet with an estate attorney. I had that will rewritten entirely. Brian was removed completely, not just reduced, but eliminated. Everything would go to Daniel, to my grandsons through Jennifer in a controlled trust that Brian could never touch, and to organizations that helped elderly victims of family abuse. I signed those papers with a steady hand. I also filed for a permanent restraining order. Brian would not be allowed to contact me, come near me, or inherit from me even after his prison sentence ended. Lawrence explained that this would send a powerful message to the judge during sentencing, that I, the victim, did not want mercy for my abuser. Some of my friends from the hospital volunteer program struggled to understand my decisions. They asked how I could be so harsh on my own son, suggested that family should forgive. But these were people who'd never been betrayed quite like this. They'd never looked at someone they birthed and raised and seen a predator staring back. One friend, Dorothy, finally understood when I explained it this way. Brian didn't make a mistake. He made a choice. He chose to endanger my life, my home, and my freedom repeatedly over 2 years. Every single time he walked into my house and went down to that basement, he made the choice again. That wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. That was sustained, calculated exploitation of his elderly mother. By the time we finished preparing my case, Lawrence told me we had something prosecutors dreamed about: a sympathetic victim with perfect credibility, overwhelming evidence, and a defendant who documented his own contempt for the person he'd victimized. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks away. I had everything ready, but I still had one more move to make, one that would ensure Brian understood exactly who he'd underestimated. I was going to face him in court and tell the truth, all of it, in my own words. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in February. I dressed carefully that day. A navy blue suit I'd worn to hospital board meetings, modest jewelry, my hair styled simply. Lawrence had told me appearance mattered, that I needed to look exactly like what I was, a respectable elderly woman who'd been victimized. But I also wanted to look strong, not fragile, not confused, not someone who could be dismissed. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from watching television shows. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a raised bench where Judge Patricia Morrison presided. She was younger than me, maybe early 60s, with steel gray hair and an expression that gave away nothing. Lawrence had researched her thoroughly. She'd built her career prosecuting organized crime and had a particular intolerance for people who preyed on vulnerable populations. Brian sat at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Richard Kowalski, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Brian had lost weight in jail, looked smaller somehow. When I walked in, he turned to look at me, and I saw something flicker across his face. Hope, maybe. Like he still believed I might save him at the last minute. I took my seat behind the prosecution table and didn't look at him again. The hearing began with procedural matters I barely followed. Then the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Amanda Reeves, called me to the stand. I'd met with Amanda twice before. She was in her 40s, whip-smart, and had told me her own grandmother had been financially exploited by a caregiver. This case was personal for her. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then I sat in that witness chair and did exactly that. Amanda walked me through the timeline gently but thoroughly. How long had I lived in the house? 46 years. When did my husband pass? 7 years ago. When did Brian get keys? Shortly after. How often did he visit? Weekly for Sunday dinners, but also entering the house alone on Tuesdays and Thursdays while I volunteered. Did I know what he was doing? No. I thought he was checking on the house, maybe doing maintenance. Then she asked about the basement. Had I gone down there? Not regularly, not for about 2 years. Why not? Because Brian had repeatedly told me the stairs were dangerous for someone my age, that my knees were bad, that I should let him handle anything down there. Did my doctor agree my knees were a problem? No. My medical records showed normal age-related wear, but nothing that would prevent me from using stairs. Amanda projected Dr. Singh's notes on a screen for the judge. There it was in black and white, Dr. Singh's documentation that Brian had expressed concerns about my cognitive function that were not supported by clinical evidence. Amanda asked me how that made me feel. I looked directly at Judge Morrison and told her the truth. I said that discovering my own son had been trying to paint me as mentally incompetent was almost worse than discovering the drug lab. Because the lab was criminal stupidity, but the manipulation was calculated cruelty. He'd been building a narrative where anything I said about him could be dismissed as the confusion of an elderly woman. Then Amanda showed the text messages. Brian's jokes about his old lady, his mocking references to me not knowing meth from mothballs, his casual contempt. The courtroom was silent as she read them aloud. I watched Brian's attorney shift uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. Amanda asked about the wire recording from my jail visit. We listened to portions of it right there in court. Brian's voice pleading with me to take partial blame, to sacrifice my freedom for his reduced sentence. When it ended, Amanda asked me one simple question. Did my son show any concern for what would happen to me if I went to prison at 76 years old? I answered that he had not, that he'd only been concerned with his own situation. Then came the cross-examination. Richard Kowalski stood up, and I could see him trying to decide how to approach me. Go too hard on an elderly woman and risk alienating the judge. Go too soft and fail to create reasonable doubt. He chose his angle carefully. He started by expressing sympathy for my situation, saying how difficult this must be for me. Then he suggested that perhaps I'd known about Brian's financial troubles and wanted to help my son. That maybe I'd been aware of activities in the basement but hadn't asked questions because I didn't want to know the answers. That maybe my memory of events was clouded by the trauma of discovery. I let him finish his theory. Then I answered in the same calm voice I'd used to explain terminal diagnoses to families. I told him I'd worked in emergency medicine for 38 years, that I'd handled crisis situations, made life or death decisions, and dealt with more trauma than most people experienced in a lifetime. My memory was not clouded, my judgment was not impaired, and if I'd known there was a meth lab in my basement, I would have called the police immediately, just as I did the moment I found out. Kowalski tried another approach. He asked if I was close with my younger son Daniel, if Daniel might have influenced my decision to cooperate with prosecutors. He was trying to suggest family politics were at play, that maybe Daniel wanted to eliminate Brian from the inheritance. I almost laughed at that one. I explained that I'd made my own decisions about my will and my testimony, that Daniel had actually begged me to consider the impact on his nephews, my grandsons, that I'd thought long and hard about those boys growing up without their father. But ultimately, I decided that they were better off learning early that actions have consequences than growing up believing you could exploit your own mother and get away with it. Judge Morrison stopped writing and looked directly at me when I said that. Kowalski kept trying, but every angle he took fell flat. He suggested I was vindictive. I calmly noted that seeking justice wasn't vindictiveness. He implied I was being manipulated by prosecutors. I pointed out that I'd sought legal counsel independently and made informed decisions. He questioned whether I truly understood the severity of the charges. I listed them back to him with their legal definitions and potential sentences. After 40 minutes, he gave up. I could see it in his posture, the way he glanced at his notes one more time and then told the judge he had no further questions. He'd realized what Lawrence had known from the start. I was the worst possible witness to cross-examine. Credible, articulate, sympathetic, and absolutely unwilling to be pushed around. When I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs were shaking, but my head was clear. I'd done what I came to do. I'd told the truth, all of it, in a way that no one could dismiss or minimize. Judge Morrison heard testimony from Frank Delgado next, then from Detective Booth. The hazmat team leader described the sophistication of the lab setup and the toxic contamination throughout my basement. A financial analyst walked through Brian's debts and the timeline of when the lab operation began. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. At the end of the day, Judge Morrison ruled that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. She also granted the prosecution's request to add additional charges of elder abuse and exploitation. She set bail at $500,000, noting that Brian posed a flight risk and had demonstrated a willingness to endanger his mother's safety for his own benefit. Brian's family couldn't make bail. He'd stay in jail until trial. As I left the courthouse that afternoon, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer approached me. She asked if I had any comment about testifying against my own son. I stopped and thought about what I wanted to say, what message I wanted other elderly people to hear if they found themselves in similar situations. I told her that family is supposed to be built on love and respect, but when someone uses your age as a weapon against you, they've broken that bond themselves. That being a mother didn't mean accepting abuse, and being elderly didn't mean being powerless. That I'd given Brian life, raised him, loved him, but I wouldn't let him destroy mine to save his own. The quote made the front page of the Metro section the next morning. My phone rang all day with calls from friends, former colleagues, even some people I barely knew. Most were supportive. A few suggested I was being too harsh, that I should show Christian forgiveness. One distant cousin actually called me cruel. But I also got calls from 3 different women, all around my age, all dealing with adult children who were taking advantage of them in different ways. Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, isolation from other family members. They'd read my quote and wanted to know how I'd found the strength to fight back. I told each of them the same thing Lawrence had told me. Document everything. Find an attorney who specializes in elder law. Remember that you have rights, regardless of your age, and understand that real love doesn't demand you sacrifice yourself for someone who's hurting you. The trial was set for 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to prepare for the biggest battle of my life. But sitting in my hotel room that night, I still couldn't go back to my contaminated house. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like myself again. Not Brian's elderly mother, not a victim, not a confused old woman. Just Patricia Kendrick, a person with 7 decades of experience and enough fight left in her to see this through. The 6 weeks before trial moved both too fast and too slow. I spent my days preparing with Amanda Reeves and Lawrence Chen, going over testimony, reviewing evidence, anticipating every possible defense strategy. My nights were harder. Alone in a corporate apartment the Victims Assistance Program had arranged, unable to return to my contaminated home, trying not to think about the life I'd lost. But I wasn't just preparing for trial. I was rebuilding. The contamination cleanup company estimated it would take 8 weeks and $45,000 to make my house safe again. Every surface in the basement had to be stripped down to bare studs. The ventilation system needed complete replacement. Even some of the flooring on the main level had to be torn up where chemicals had seeped through. My insurance refused to cover it. There was an exclusion for illegal activities, and it didn't matter that I wasn't the one committing them. I sat in that insurance agent's office, a man half my age explaining why they couldn't help me, and I felt the anger rise again. But I didn't waste it on him. I saved it. I'd need it for what was coming. I paid for the cleanup using money from the savings account Thomas and I had built over 40 years. Every dollar I spent felt like a piece of my husband's legacy being destroyed by the son we'd raised together. But I wrote those checks anyway, because that house was mine, and I wasn't going to let Brian take it from me even after everything else he'd stolen. During those weeks, something unexpected happened. The local news coverage of my preliminary hearing testimony had sparked conversations in the community. I started getting invitations to speak at senior centers and community groups about recognizing elder abuse. At first, I declined. I didn't feel qualified to advise anyone. But Lawrence encouraged me, said it would help the prosecution's case to show I was an advocate, not just a victim. So I went to a meeting at the Lakewood Senior Center on a Wednesday afternoon. There were maybe 30 people there, most of them around my age or older. I stood in front of them, feeling awkward and exposed. But when I started talking about what Brian had done and how he'd used my age against me, I saw heads nodding. Hands went up with questions. One woman, probably in her 80s, asked how I'd found the courage to turn in my own son. Her voice cracked when she said it. After the meeting, she pulled me aside and told me her grandson had been stealing from her for 2 years, small amounts at first, but getting bolder. She'd confronted him once, and he'd told her she must be confused, mixing up her finances because of her age. She'd actually started to believe him. I gave her Lawrence's business card and told her what I'd learned. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And remember that love shouldn't cost you your dignity or your security. That conversation stayed with me. So did dozens of others like it over those weeks. I realized how common this was, how many elderly people were being victimized by their own families and staying silent out of shame or misplaced loyalty. It gave my fight a purpose beyond just my own justice. Meanwhile, the prosecution's case was getting stronger. Marcus Webb, Lawrence's investigator, had uncovered connections between Brian and a larger drug distribution network. The people Brian owed money to weren't just bookies, they were connected to organized crime. Brian hadn't just been cooking meth to pay off debts, he'd been cooking it for people who were using him as a small-scale producer. My basement had been part of a criminal enterprise. This discovery added federal charges to Brian's case. The FBI got involved. Suddenly, my son wasn't just facing state charges for drug manufacturing and elder abuse. He was looking at federal trafficking charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. Richard Kowalski, his attorney, started making noise about a plea deal. Amanda Reeves called me to discuss it. She explained that Kowalski had approached her about Brian pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperating against his suppliers. It would mean a lighter sentence for Brian, maybe 7 to 10 years instead of the 15 to 20 he was facing at trial. She asked me how I felt about that. I thought about it for 2 days. I talked to Daniel, who was conflicted, angry at his brother, but worried about his nephews growing up with their father in prison for decades. I talked to Dr. Singh, who reminded me that I needed to do what was right for my own healing, not what others expected. I talked to Dorothy and my other friends from the volunteer program, who had various opinions. But mostly, I sat with myself. I thought about those text messages where Brian had mocked me. I thought about him trying to convince me to go to prison to save him. I thought about 2 years of him walking into my home and cooking poison while I remained oblivious. I thought about the cameras he'd hidden to surveil me. I thought about him telling my doctor I was cognitively declining. Then I thought about that woman at the senior center, the one whose grandson was stealing from her. I thought about the message a plea deal would send, that if you exploit your elderly relatives, you might get a reduced sentence if you cooperate. That family ties and cooperation could mitigate the violation of trust. I called Amanda back and told her I opposed the plea deal. I wanted this to go to trial. I wanted a jury to hear what Brian had done and decide his punishment accordingly. I wanted this case to stand as a warning to anyone who thought elderly people were easy targets. Amanda warned me that trial would be harder, that Kowalski would attack my credibility more aggressively, that the jury might sympathize with Brian as a desperate father who made terrible choices, that there were no guarantees. I told her I understood the risks. But I'd spent 76 years on this earth, and if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that some battles were worth fighting even when the outcome was uncertain. The plea negotiations fell apart. We were going to trial. In the final week before jury selection, Lawrence had me do something unexpected. He arranged for me to visit my house with the cleanup crew supervisor. The basement renovation was nearly complete. New walls, new floors, new HVAC system. It smelled like fresh paint and sawdust instead of chemicals. The supervisor showed me all the work they'd done, explained how they'd tested every surface multiple times to ensure no contamination remained. Standing in that basement, I felt something shift. This space that Brian had violated, that he'd turned into his criminal operation, was clean again. It was mine again. The physical contamination could be removed, scrubbed away, replaced with new materials. The emotional contamination would take longer, but it could heal too. I went upstairs to the kitchen where Frank Delgado had stood 6 months ago telling me to call the police. I looked out the window at my neighborhood, at Mrs. Chen's house and the Rodriguez family's lawn, where their grandchildren played. This was my home, my life, my 46 years of memories in these rooms. Brian had tried to take it all from me, but he'd failed. That night, I did something I hadn't done since the day of Frank's discovery. I prayed. Not in church, not with any formal words, but sitting in my temporary apartment looking at photos of Thomas. I talked to him. I told him about Brian, about the trial, about everything that had happened. I asked him if I was doing the right thing. I didn't hear any answer, obviously, but I felt a clarity settle over me. Thomas had been a man of principle. He'd been honest to a fault, believed in accountability, taught our boys that character was defined by choices. He would have been devastated by what Brian had done, but he wouldn't have protected him from consequences. He would have done exactly what I was doing. The trial was set to begin on Monday. Amanda did a final prep session with me on Friday afternoon, walking through the most likely questions, the most aggressive lines of attack Kowalski might use, the emotional moments that might trip me up. She asked if I was ready. I told her about my years in emergency medicine, about holding dying patients' hands and telling families their loved ones didn't make it, about making decisions in seconds that meant life or death. I told her I'd testified at medical board hearings, faced malpractice attorneys who tried to tear apart my nursing decisions, stood my ground when doctors twice my age tried to override my assessments. I was ready. That weekend, I did something for myself. I went to the salon and had my hair done. I bought a new outfit for trial, a charcoal gray suit that made me feel professional and strong. I got my nails done for the first time in years. Some people might think that was vain, preparing for trial like it was a social event. But I understood something those people didn't. Presentation matters. Confidence matters. When you walk into that courtroom, you need to look like someone who knows their worth, who can't be dismissed or intimidated. I needed to look like someone a jury would believe and respect. Sunday night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from a kind of electric anticipation. Tomorrow, I would sit in that witness chair again. Tomorrow, 12 strangers would hear my story and decide whether my son deserved mercy or justice. Tomorrow, I would find out if 76 years of building a life of integrity and honesty meant anything in the end. At dawn on Monday, I stood in front of my mirror, adjusted my suit jacket, and looked at the woman staring back. She had lines around her eyes from 7 decades of smiling and crying. She had age spots on her hands from years of working and living. She had gray hair and reading glasses and all the physical markers of being elderly. But she also had steel in her spine, fire in her eyes, and a voice that wouldn't be silenced. Brian had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that age equaled weakness. Tomorrow, I was going to teach him, and anyone else who needed to learn it, that the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. The courthouse was packed on Monday morning. I hadn't expected that. Amanda explained that the case had drawn media attention. The combination of drugs, family betrayal, and elder abuse made it newsworthy. As I walked through the lobby, I saw reporters with cameras, sketch artists, and a line of people waiting to get into the gallery. The jury had been selected the week before. 12 people, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to early 70s. During voir dire, Amanda had focused on finding people who had elderly parents or grandparents, people who might understand the particular vulnerability of being in your 70s and trusting your own child. Kowalski had tried to exclude anyone who seemed too sympathetic to elder abuse victims, but there were limits to how many people he could dismiss. I sat behind the prosecution table in the same navy suit I'd worn to the preliminary hearing. Daniel was there, sitting right behind me with his wife, Rebecca. Jennifer, Brian's soon-to-be ex-wife, had chosen not to attend. She'd sent me a letter the week before, apologizing for not seeing what Brian was doing, for not protecting me. I'd written back telling her she was a victim too, that Brian had lied to both of us. When they brought Brian into the courtroom, I forced myself to look at him. He'd lost more weight. His orange jail jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He glanced at me once, quickly, then looked away. The hope I'd seen in his face at the preliminary hearing was gone. He looked defeated already, and the trial was just beginning. Judge Morrison entered, and we all rose. She was all business, no warmth but no hostility either, just professional competence. She instructed the jury on their duties, explained the charges, and told them to keep open minds until all evidence was presented. Then she invited Amanda to make her opening statement. Amanda stood and walked to the jury box. She was masterful. She started by asking the jurors to imagine working your entire life, raising children, losing your spouse, and finally having a home that was truly yours, paid off, secure, a place of safety. Then she asked them to imagine discovering that one of those children had been using that home, that sanctuary, as a criminal operation. That he'd installed cameras to surveil you. That he'd told doctors you were mentally declining to discredit anything you might say. That he'd put your freedom, your health, and your life at risk for 2 years while sitting at your dinner table every Sunday, pretending everything was fine. She walked them through the evidence methodically. The discovery of the lab by an independent plumber. The timeline of Brian's visits matching production schedules. The text messages mocking me. The financial records showing his debts and desperate situation. The hidden cameras. The attempts to paint me as incompetent. The wire recording where he'd tried to convince me to take partial blame. Then Amanda said something that made the entire courtroom go silent. She told the jury that elder abuse was often invisible because victims were ashamed to report it, and perpetrators knew how to exploit that shame. She said that Brian had counted on me being too embarrassed to admit my own son had victimized me, too concerned about family reputation to seek justice. She said the only reason we were here today was because I'd chosen dignity over denial, chosen to believe I deserved better than what my son had given me. When Amanda sat down, I saw several jurors looking at me with expressions I recognized from my nursing days. Compassion mixed with anger on my behalf. It was a good start. Kowalski stood for his opening statement, and I could see his strategy immediately. He wasn't going to deny the meth lab. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, he was going to argue that Brian was a desperate father who made terrible choices but never intended to harm me. That he'd actually been trying to protect me by keeping me away from the basement. That his comments to doctors about my cognitive state came from genuine concern, not manipulation. That his debts had driven him to desperation, and desperate people do things they'd never normally consider. Kowalski painted Brian as a victim of circumstances, gambling addiction, predatory lenders, the pressure of supporting a family in an expensive economy. He suggested that while Brian's actions were illegal and wrong, they didn't rise to the level of elder abuse because he'd never directly threatened me or stolen from me. The meth lab was separate from our relationship, he argued. It just happened to be in my house. I listened to this fiction being constructed and felt my jaw tighten. But Amanda had prepared me for this. She'd told me Kowalski would try to separate the drug charges from the abuse charges, would try to make the jury see Brian as a criminal, but not a monster. Our job was to show that you couldn't separate them, that the entire operation was built on exploiting and deceiving me. The testimony began. Frank Delgado was first, describing the discovery in vivid detail. He explained how he'd recognized the equipment immediately, how terrified he'd been for my safety, how I'd been genuinely shocked when he told me what was in my basement. Kowalski's cross-examination tried to suggest Frank might have been mistaken, that maybe it wasn't actually a functioning lab, but Frank held firm. He'd grown up around drugs, he said. He knew what he'd seen. Detective Booth testified next about the investigation, the extent of the operation, the contamination levels. She described Brian's arrival at my house within minutes of Frank's discovery and his immediate panic. She noted that this suggested surveillance of the property. When Kowalski suggested Brian might have just been stopping by coincidentally, Detective Booth listed the probabilities and said in her 15 years of police work, she'd learned not to believe in those kinds of coincidences. The technical witnesses came next, the hazmat team, the toxicology expert, the financial analyst. Each one built the case brick by brick. The lab had been sophisticated and dangerous. The contamination could have made me seriously ill over time. Brian's financial records showed a clear timeline of when his debts became critical and when the lab operation began. Then came the harder testimony. Dr. Singh took the stand and described Brian's conversations with her, his concerns about my mental state that she'd found unfounded. She read her notes documenting that my cognitive function was normal, that I was sharp and articulate, that Brian's characterizations didn't match clinical reality. She said something that hit hard, that she'd actually been more concerned about Brian's behavior than mine, that his insistence on discussing my supposed decline had seemed obsessive. Kowalski tried to suggest Dr. Singh might have missed early signs of dementia, that maybe Brian had noticed things she hadn't. Dr. Singh shut that down immediately. She explained the thorough cognitive testing she'd done, the benchmarks that showed I was functioning at a completely normal level for my age. She noted that one of the early signs of elder abuse was actually perpetrators claiming their victims were mentally declining to isolate them and control the narrative. She'd seen it before in her practice. Marcus Webb, Lawrence's investigator, testified about the hidden cameras. He'd found 3 of them, one in my living room, one in my kitchen, and one in the upstairs hallway. All had been purchased by Brian using a credit card. All had been positioned to monitor my movements and activities. The footage had been streaming to Brian's phone. The jury looked physically uncomfortable when they saw the camera placement on the diagrams Marcus had prepared. Then came the text messages. Amanda had them enlarged and projected on screens. The jury read Brian's words about his old lady who wouldn't know meth from mothballs. They read him telling his friends about his setup and how convenient it was that I never went to the basement. They read him joking about me being too old and confused to figure out what was happening. I watched the jurors' faces as they read. Several women looked disgusted. One of the older men was shaking his head. The youngest juror, a woman in her 20s, actually had tears in her eyes. These weren't just evidence of a crime. They were evidence of contempt, of a son who saw his mother as a joke, as something to be exploited and mocked. Finally, on the 3rd day of trial, Amanda called me to the stand. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, but when I actually stood up and walked to that witness chair, my heart was pounding so hard, I thought everyone in the courtroom must hear it. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, facing the jury. Amanda started gently, walking me through my background. 38 years as a nurse, 46 years in the house, 7 years as a widow, 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, a quiet life of work and family and community service. She established me as a real person, someone with a history and dignity. Then she asked about Brian. I described him as a child, bright, energetic, sometimes headstrong, but loving. I talked about raising him, about the hopes Thomas and I had for him. I explained how he'd stepped up after Thomas died, or at least how I'd thought he'd stepped up, how I'd appreciated his attention and concern. Amanda asked when things had changed. I thought carefully before answering. I told her I didn't think things had changed. I think they'd always been this way, but I hadn't seen it. That looking back with the clarity hindsight provides, I could see patterns I'd missed. Times when Brian had isolated me from other family members by suggesting they were too busy or didn't care as much. Times when he'd discouraged me from hiring help or accepting support from friends. Times when he'd positioned himself as my only reliable connection to the outside world. Then we got to the basement, the smell, the calls to Brian that went nowhere. Amanda had me describe my frustration, my certainty that something was wrong, Brian's dismissals. She asked why I'd called Morrison and Sons instead of waiting for Brian to handle it. I explained that after 76 years of life, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that something was dangerous. I described the morning of the discovery, Frank going downstairs, the minutes of waiting, his panicked emergence, his words about the laboratory. Amanda asked how I'd felt in that moment. I told her the truth, that my first thought had been that it was impossible, that there had to be a mistake. My second thought had been about Brian, wondering if he was in some kind of trouble. My third thought, the one that had made my stomach drop, was that he'd known, that he'd done this deliberately. Then we listened to portions of the wire recording, hearing Brian's voice in that courtroom, hearing him beg me to take partial responsibility, hearing him try to manipulate me one more time. It was almost unbearable, but I kept my composure. Amanda asked if Brian had shown any concern for what would happen to me if I went to prison at my age. I simply said no, that he'd only been focused on reducing his own sentence. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Kowalski wasn't taking notes anymore. He was just listening, and I could see in his expression that he knew this wasn't going well for his client. Amanda's final questions were about forgiveness and family. She asked if I'd struggled with the decision to cooperate with prosecutors. I told her yes, that it had been one of the hardest decisions of my life, that I'd thought about my grandsons, about family loyalty, about whether I was being too harsh. But then I'd thought about the woman at the senior center whose grandson was stealing from her. I'd thought about all the other elderly people who were being victimized by family members and staying silent because they were ashamed or felt obligated to protect their abusers. I'd thought about what message I would be sending if I chose family loyalty over justice. And I'd realized that real family loyalty means holding people accountable when they hurt you. That love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. That I could love the child Brian had been while refusing to protect the man he'd become. When Amanda sat down, Judge Morrison called a recess before cross-examination. I stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs. Daniel squeezed my hand as I passed. I'd made it through the direct examination. Now came the hard part. After the break, Kowalski approached the witness stand, and I could see he'd made a decision about his strategy. He was going to try to paint me as vindictive, as a mother whose love had turned to hatred, whose desire for revenge had overcome any natural maternal instinct. He started by asking if I loved Brian. I said I loved who I thought he was, but I didn't know if that person had ever really existed. He asked if I wanted him to suffer. I said I wanted him to face consequences for his choices, which wasn't the same thing as wanting suffering. He asked if I'd ever considered that prison would destroy his life, his marriage, his relationship with his children. I looked directly at Kowalski and told him that Brian had destroyed those things himself, that I hadn't put the meth lab in my basement. He did. That I hadn't lied to his wife about their finances. He did. That I hadn't mocked his mother in text messages or tried to convince her to go to prison to save him. He did. Every terrible consequence he was facing came from his own choices, not from my decision to tell the truth about those choices. Kowalski tried several other angles. He suggested I was being influenced by my younger son, that maybe Daniel wanted to eliminate Brian from the inheritance. I explained that I'd made my own decisions about my will based on who'd violated my trust and who hadn't. He implied I was embarrassed about not noticing the lab and taking it out on Brian. I said I wasn't embarrassed. I was angry, which was the appropriate response to being exploited and surveilled in my own home. He even suggested, carefully, that perhaps my age had made me more rigid, less capable of forgiveness, less able to see nuance in difficult situations. That was his biggest mistake. I told him that my age had actually given me more perspective, not less, that I'd seen enough of life to know the difference between a mistake and a pattern of behavior, that I'd held enough dying hands and heard enough deathbed regrets to understand that enabling someone's destructive behavior wasn't kindness. It was cruelty to everyone involved, including the person you were trying to protect. I told him that 76 years had taught me that some people will keep taking as long as you keep giving, and the only way to help them was to stop. That real love sometimes meant letting someone face the full consequences of their actions, because that was the only thing that might actually change them. When Kowalski sat down, he looked deflated. The cross-examination that was supposed to discredit me had instead reinforced everything Amanda had established, that I was thoughtful, articulate, principled, and absolutely clear-eyed about what had happened and why it mattered. The trial lasted another 2 days with closing arguments and jury instructions. But I knew, sitting in that courtroom, that the case had been decided during my testimony. The jury had seen a 76-year-old woman who refused to be diminished by age or victimized by family ties. They'd seen someone who valued justice over comfort, truth over denial. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks after the verdict. Judge Morrison had ordered a pre-sentence investigation, wanting a complete picture of Brian's history and the impact of his crimes before deciding his punishment. I'd been asked to submit a victim impact statement, and I'd spent days writing and rewriting it, trying to find words that captured what this experience had cost me. The courtroom felt different that morning. Smaller somehow, quieter. The media attention had died down after the verdict. It was just us now, me, Daniel, Amanda, Brian, Kowalski, and Judge Morrison. The moment that would determine the next decade or more of my son's life. Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to read my statement aloud. I said yes. I needed Brian to hear this in my voice, not just read it on paper. I stood at the podium and looked at the page I'd prepared, but then I set it aside. These words needed to come from my heart, not from something I'd rehearsed. I told Judge Morrison that the hardest part wasn't discovering the meth lab. It wasn't the contamination or the cleanup costs or even the humiliation of having police swarm my home while my neighbors watched. The hardest part was realizing that for 2 years, every Sunday dinner, every phone call, every moment of what I thought was connection with my son had been a performance. That he'd sat at my table, eaten my food, hugged me goodbye, all while knowing he was using my home for criminal activity and laughing about it with his friends. I explained that Brian hadn't just committed crimes, he'd weaponized my age against me. He'd used societal assumptions about elderly confusion and fragility to build a shield for his operation. He'd tried to make medical professionals question my competence. He'd surveilled me in my own home. He'd counted on me being too ashamed or too loyal to fight back. But then I said something I hadn't planned. I thanked him. The courtroom went still. I thanked him because his betrayal had taught me something crucial. That my age wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. That 7 decades of life had given me the wisdom to recognize manipulation, the courage to demand justice, and the clarity to know my own worth. That being 76 meant I'd survived enough to know what battles mattered and which ones to walk away from. This one mattered. Judge Morrison listened without interruption. When I finished and sat down, she took a moment before speaking. Then she addressed Brian directly. She told him that she'd seen many drug cases in her courtroom, many defendants who'd made terrible choices out of desperation. But she said this case stood apart because of the calculated exploitation involved, that he hadn't just broken the law. He'd broken the most fundamental trust between parent and child. And he'd done it while trying to convince everyone his victim was too old and confused to be believed. The sentence was 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. No parole eligibility for at least 10 years. Brian would be 61 when he got out, if he served the minimum. His sons would be grown men. I felt Daniel tense beside me, but I felt only a strange calm. Justice wasn't always satisfying, but it was necessary. This was necessary. After the hearing, Amanda walked me out of the courthouse. She told me the case would likely be cited in elder abuse prosecutions going forward, that my testimony would help other victims find their voices. I appreciated her words, but honestly, I was just exhausted, ready to be done with courtrooms and lawyers and reliving trauma. My house was finally ready. The contamination was gone, every surface tested and cleared. I'd moved back in 2 weeks earlier, and slowly it was starting to feel like home again. I'd rearranged furniture, painted the kitchen a new color, planted flowers in the garden Thomas and I had designed together 40 years ago. I was reclaiming the space Brian had violated. I also started volunteering regularly with the Elder Justice Coalition, speaking to groups about recognizing abuse, encouraging people to trust their instincts and seek help. Every talk I gave, at least 2 or 3 people approached me afterward with their own stories. The isolation, the manipulation, the fear of speaking up against family. I'd give them resources, connect them with attorneys like Lawrence, remind them they deserved better. Frank Delgado and I had become genuine friends. He stopped by every few weeks, always finding some small repair that needed attention, but really just checking on me. He'd saved more than my house that morning. He'd saved my sense that there were still good people in the world who did the right thing even when it was uncomfortable. Daniel and his family visited every Sunday now. We'd reclaimed that tradition Brian had corrupted. My grandsons through Daniel were getting older, asking questions about why they didn't see Uncle Brian anymore. Daniel and I had decided to tell them age-appropriate versions of the truth. Not to poison them against their uncle, but to teach them that actions have consequences and that family love doesn't mean accepting abuse. Jennifer had moved to Michigan with Brian's boys. She sent cards occasionally, updates about how they were doing. I sent gifts for birthdays and holidays. Those children weren't responsible for their father's choices, and I wouldn't punish them for it. Today, I'm 77 years old. I've been on this earth long enough to bury friends, survive losses, watch the world change in ways my younger self never imagined. And I've learned this: getting older doesn't mean getting weaker. It means getting clearer. It means understanding what truly matters and having the courage to fight for it. Brian wrote me from prison last month. 3 pages of apologies and justifications and pleas for understanding. I read it once, then filed it away. Maybe someday I'll respond. Maybe someday enough time will pass that forgiveness becomes possible. But that day isn't today, and it might not be tomorrow. Forgiveness can't be rushed, and it definitely can't be demanded by the person who caused the harm. What I have now is peace, real peace. The kind that comes from knowing you stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to stay silent. From knowing that your voice mattered and your truth was believed. From understanding that 77 years of life had given you everything you needed to fight back against someone who thought you were too old to be dangerous. If my story resonates with you, if you've faced something similar or know someone who has, I'd love to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments below. I always wonder where these stories reach, how far the message travels. And please subscribe to this channel, because every grandmother, every elderly person who's been underestimated and discounted has a story worth telling. Mine just happened to involve a meth lab. But the real story? It's about a woman who refused to let age define her limits, who chose dignity over denial, and who proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and let the consequences fall where they will. At 77, I'm not done living. I'm not done fighting. I'm not done showing the world that underestimating someone because of their age is a mistake you only make once. Brian learned that lesson the hard way. I hope others can learn it more gently, by listening to stories like mine and understanding that respect for elderly people isn't optional courtesy. It's basic human decency. And when it's violated, there should be consequences that matter. My name is Patricia Kendrick. I'm a retired nurse, a mother, a grandmother, and a survivor. And I'm just getting started with the rest of my life.